Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you today to our program, Citing Works in Text Using 7th Edition APA Style, which is sponsored by the American Psychological Association. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I would like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you may see a chat panel and a Q&A panel. Please use the Q&A panel to pose questions to our speakers today. They'll be responding through that Q&A panel and at the end of the presentation in a dedicated Q&A session. So if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in throughout. That chat panel is where you can get a hold of me to let me know about any technical issues that you may be experiencing. We'll troubleshoot those issues privately using the chat. Also note that we are recording today's program, so everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. All right, that is enough out of me. At this point, we'll start things up and pass it over to our featured speakers today. And Tim is here to kick us off.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Good afternoon. In earlier webinars, we discussed what's new in the 7th edition of APA style and also how to create references in 7th edition style. So today's webinar is about citing those references in the body of your paper. The objectives for today's webinar are learning to paraphrase effectively, add citations to paraphrases, write and cite long paraphrases, quote effectively, add citations to direct quotations, and use page number alternatives in your citations. So I will start with writing sentences. So here, this is an infographic we shared in our last webinar about the 6 steps to proper citation. Today's webinar will focus on, you can see there are 3, 4, and 5. That's writing a sentence that paraphrases an idea from another source or multiple sources or quotes directly from another source. We'll look at how you can write in your own voice but properly cite those works by creating in-text citations and then the corresponding reference. We covered how to create the references in the earlier webinar, which is on YouTube, so today we're focusing on the in-text citations again. If you would like this infographic, it is available on our website. So in step 3, this is when you write a sentence that mentions or summarizes ideas from another work, you're going to paraphrase or you're going to quote. Paraphrasing, of course, means to restate the idea in your own words. And in a research paper, that's usually from a published article or a book, but you can paraphrase from any other source, and we'll show some of those other kinds of sources later in the presentation. And then, of course, direct quotation is reproducing the text, the quote word for word. And each approach has its pros and cons. So for the pros of paraphrasing, paraphrasing lets you summarize an idea or multiple ideas from one source, and that's a useful starting point when you want to establish an existing idea or facts before building on those in your own words and in your own work. Or you can synthesize information from various sources, and when you do that, it's important to be clear which idea comes from which source, and we'll look at examples of that. So in a paraphrase, unlike a direct quote, it's also easy to highlight the most significant details, and you can trust that the reader who wants the full picture, the full text, can use your citation and reference to go find the full text. The biggest drawback to paraphrasing might be that it is possible to misrepresent the original author's intention. Authors obviously choose their words very carefully, and so it's always possible that when you reshape the idea in your own words, you might accidentally misrepresent the idea or give it more or less weight than the author really intended. So before paraphrasing, it's important that you read the full context of the work that that quote is from, and so that you're confident that you're representing it accurately. And it's challenging to do it well, but you get better with practice. So on to direct quotations, pros and cons. A lot of times the direct quote is used for definitions, whether that's from a dictionary or from a paper where there's a specialized term that's been defined. The authors in both of those cases took great care to define the words, and it's usually just best to use their exact wording. And that another use for direct quotes is to show memorable or succinct wording, and by including that memorable quote, you can then respond to the actual word choices that the author used if that's the important part. For direct quotes, it's just a little easier. You don't have to worry that you're misrepresenting if you've quoted word for word. Drawbacks, including a direct quote could hurt your ability to make the arguments and to develop your thesis. It's difficult to compare and contrast the ideas of, say, multiple authors by showing one quote and another quote and sort of asking the reader to compare and contrast rather than doing that work for them by summarizing, paraphrasing the idea. Also, with direct quotes, you have to write the text in a way grammatically around your own wording and in a way that makes sense, and you have formatting, quotation mark, punctuations to consider, so there are other things that you don't have to worry about with paraphrasing. And it can be difficult for authors to integrate. If you have too many quotations, it can be difficult to put them all in there without creating kind of a choppy or stilted experience. So, to summarize, when writing your paper, you're trying to contribute your own ideas and knowledge, building on other works, of course. So a direct quote can be effective when an author's exact wording is important to note, but paraphrasing allows you to write in your own voice and to compare and contrast ideas and to show that you've understood the work that you're building on. And that's why authors tend to do more paraphrasing than quoting. One more thing on that. In the publication manual, there's no limit set on the number of quotes that you might put in your paper, but your professor or an instructor, an institution might impose a limit. So if you're going to be paraphrasing, what is an effective way to do that? Effective paraphrasing matches the style of your own writing style, your voice. It captures the essential details that were in the original work. It selectively leaves out details that were important in the original but are not the point you're trying to talk about. And it contextualizes information to support your argument, particularly when you can paraphrase multiple sources and get it all in your paper succinctly and move on to the things you're trying to say. So we noticed that when people first start to try to paraphrase, they may instead be patch writing. And that is that they're copying the text and making just minor adjustments, like deleting a few words, flipping sentence structure, making one-to-one substitutions for words. And there is no exact formula for how many words need to change, but we can look at some examples, or an example in this case. So this is one example from an article, and here I'm going to read the original and then the patch-written attempt to paraphrase. So the original is: the resultant expert-generated prototype indicated that high levels of openness to feeling, O, positive emotions, E, and straightforwardness, A, are particularly indicative of healthy personality functioning. And so the Sorry about that. Well, pop-up obscured my window for a second. The patch-written example is, or attempt to paraphrase is: the prototype demonstrated that high levels of positive emotions, openness to feeling, and straightforwardness indicate healthy personality functioning. So why is that patch writing? The words are largely in the same order. It's sort of the same sentence. The less important words were simply removed, and then synonyms were substituted. How could we do that a little better? Here, I'll just read the paraphrase. and that is healthy personality functioning is associated with high levels of openness to feelings, positive emotions, and straightforwardness. So why is that better? Why is that a good paraphrase? The sentence structure is different. It's a new sentence. There's a new focus and context. It's about functioning versus a prototype of functioning. And it has different verbs that support the context, associated versus indicated. So you'll notice that some of the words are still there, and that's okay. Even in a paraphrase, there's no formula, again, for how many words have to be different. And that is all I have about paraphrasing, and I'm going to turn this over to Haley.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks everyone for attending our presentation on 7th edition in-text citations. Now that you've learned about how to write your paraphrase sentence, it's important to make sure it is appropriately cited. So I'll be walking through how to create reference list entries and in-text citations for those. So we're now on step 4 of the 6 steps to proper citation, which is writing a reference list entry for the work you are citing. This webinar is only going to touch briefly on creating references rather than covering all of the basic steps, tips, and exceptions. At APA Style, we recommend writing a reference list entry first and then creating the corresponding in-text citation, because the reference list entry guides how to create the in-text citation. So you will create your citation based on the information at the beginning of the reference, which is usually the author and year. Luckily, you do not need to memorize all the reference formats, because Chapter 10 of the Publication Manual, as well as the Concise Guide to APA Style, are filled with reference templates you can use to create your reference from the information on the work, and reference examples for all types of works that are organized by group, then by category, and then by type. The key to determining the formats in which one of those templates or examples to use is knowing the document type of the work you are citing. For instance, a journal article, edited book chapter, report, thesis, film, web page, etc. Because the type of work dictates which reference template or example you follow to create your reference entry. So the first step is determining what type of work you're using and not mistaking the type of work with the method of retrieval for that work, because whether you read a work online or in print really matters. Then just follow the template or example for the specific reference you are citing. Hundreds of examples, including additional examples for types of work not covered in the manual, are available on the APA Style website at the link shown in the bottom left box on your screen. Or if you go to the Style and Grammar Guidelines header on the website, and the references drop-down reference examples is the second option. Like in the book, examples on that page are broken down by category, group, and type. With very few exceptions, you need to have a reference entry for every in-text citation and in-text citation for every reference entry. Exceptions, most notably personal communications, are covered in Section 8.9 of the Publication Manual, as well as on the website. This means there should be a reference entry and only a single reference entry for each work you cite in the text of your paper. I'll be moving on in a minute, but as I mentioned, this is just a broad summary of the process for creating references in 7th edition APA Style. A thorough overview can be found in our previous webinar on creating references using 7th edition APA Style, found on the tutorials webinar page of the APA Style website. That URL is shown in the second box at the bottom of your screen, and Mark also pasted a link to it in the chat in this webinar. Once you've written your reference, you're now ready to move on to step 5, which is creating the corresponding in-text citation. Again, you use the first 2 elements of the reference to create the in-text citation. In most cases, as the author, usually the surname of the first author if an individual author, or the name of a group author, and the date, which is the year. This is why it is known as an author date citation. Readers then use the in-text citation to identify the corresponding entry in the reference list as they read your paper. And from the reference entry, they can then identify and retrieve the work you used. You must have an in-text citation for every work in the reference list, which is something all writers will want to check before submitting their papers. Shown here is the reference entry for a journal article, and below it the corresponding parenthetical and narrative citations as they would appear in the text for that reference list entry. And then those in-text citations can be written in one of 2 formats, either parenthetical or narrative. You will use one of these formats, but not both, to write each citation in the text of your paper. Descriptions and examples are shown here. For a parenthetical citation, provide the author and date in parentheses separated with a comma. This is shown in the first example with Swan 2020 all in parentheses. For narrative citation, mention the author in the narrative of your paper followed by the date in parentheses. This is shown in the second example with Swan in the text followed by 2020 in parentheses. It is also acceptable to write the date in the narrative without parentheses when it makes sense to do so. For instance, if you wanted to emphasize the relevancy of new findings, you might instead say, a recent 2020 study by Swan. It's acceptable to use either format depending on what you are writing. For instance, you might use parenthetical citations to help you keep focus on the material or cite multiple works at a time. Whereas you might use a narrative citation if you're discussing a work at length, highlighting the author of a work, or wanting to identify a characteristic of that work as its author. This table is similar to Table 8.1 in the Publication Manual and Concise Guide. It shows examples of the basic in-text citation formats. This table can be accessed quickly from inside the front cover of the books as well. It shows examples of parenthetical and narrative citations for the different number and types of authors a work can have. As shown, the citation format depends on the number of authors for a work. The table is broken down by one author, two authors, three or more authors, and group author, each of which I will talk about individually in more detail. So we'll start easy. For work with one author, include that one author's name in every citation every time it appears in your paper. Similarly, for two authors, include both authors' names in every citation. Use an ampersand between the two names in parenthetical citations, and use the word and between the two names in narrative citations, as shown in the Akebe and O examples on your screen. And once you get past two authors, the citation format is the same for any number of authors. This is a new update in the 7th edition manual designed to simplify the citation process. For works with three or more authors, write the surname of the first author, and then abbreviate the rest of the author names to et al. In every in-text citation, including the first citation. Note that while it is the general rule and will be the format for most citations for works with three or more authors, you may need to include additional authors' names to avoid ambiguity in cases when multiple works with three or more authors would shorten to the same form and thus result in identical in-text citations. In this case, write out as many names as needed to distinguish the references and then abbreviate the rest of the names to et al. In every citation. Guidelines for avoiding ambiguity in in-text citations are discussed in depth in the Publication Manual and Concise Guide, and on the Basic Principles page under in-text citations on the APA-CIO website at the URL shown on your screen. In this citation example, for work with three or more authors, we have included the first author's surname, Gomez, replaced the rest of the author's names but et al., and then ended with the year. Then there are group authors. The author of a work can consist of one group, multiple groups, or a group plus individual authors. Organizations and government agencies are common group authors, especially for works like reports and web pages. And a common mistake writers tend to make is thinking that because a work does not list individual authors, it does not have an author. Instead, it is important to check whether that work is actually authored by an organization, agency, or other group, and if so, include that as the group author. In any case, the format is the same as already described and depends on the number of authors for that work. One or two group or individual authors, write them in every in-text citation. Three or more, write the first author's name, and then et al. For the subsequent authors. We know group author names can be long, and it is acceptable to abbreviate a group author if that abbreviation is well known and, in general, used at least 3 times in your paper. Otherwise, it may not make sense to use an abbreviation, as it can be hard to remember and often more confusing for your readers. If you are abbreviating a group author name, in the first citation, provide the full name followed by the abbreviation. If the group author name is appearing for the first time in the parenthetical citation, put the abbreviation in square brackets after the full name, followed by a comma and the year, as shown in the first example for the National Institute of Nursing and Research. If the group name appears in a narrative citation, write the full name in the text and then put the abbreviation, a comma, and the year in parentheses after it. In both cases, thereafter use only the abbreviation in any citations for that group. Do not alternate between using the abbreviation and the full term. It's important to note that you are not required to use abbreviations for group author names, and often it's easier and clearer to go with the full name. Again, it is best to limit use of abbreviations to those groups that are well known and to avoid making up abbreviations. The longer form is often clearer. For instance, in this example, it is easier and less confusing to stick with the full Yale University rather than making up a new abbreviation for the purpose of your paper. So we talked about the format for reference and in-text citations. Now we will discuss the steps for adding those citations to your paper. Because every idea, fact, finding, and so forth in your paper that is not your own original idea must be accompanied by an in-text citation. Citations are required for both paraphrases and direct quotations, and I will start with discussing citations and paraphrases. As described here, when citing a paraphrase, you must have an author date citation, meaning that the in-text citation includes the author, or in select cases, the title and the date of the work. You may also include the page number, page range, or other location information for paraphrase material if doing so would help direct readers to the specific information you are paraphrasing, say in a long or complex work. For example, to identify a few paragraphs paraphrased from a whole book. The simpler case is when you have one sentence supported by one source. When the same source applies to the whole sentence, put a parenthetical citation at the end of the sentence, or cite work in the narrative of that sentence, usually at the beginning. Here we show examples in parenthetical and narrative format for the cite on source we created a reference entry for earlier. So I'll read those aloud to you. In the parenthetical example, healthy personality functioning is associated with high levels of openness to feelings. Then in parentheses, Blyden et al. 2020. In the narrative example, Blyden et al. 2020 found that healthy personality functioning is associated with high levels of openness to feelings. You can see how that in-text citation is integrated into the sentence in different ways for both of those two formats. You may also have one paraphrase sentence that has multiple ideas supported by different sources. In this case, your sentence will need to include multiple citations. When different sources apply to different parts of the same sentence, put a parenthetical citation after each idea, or cite work in the narrative as you describe each idea. The parenthetical format usually creates a smoother sentence, and this is demonstrated in the example here. Personality traits predict positive life outcomes such as health. In parentheses, Goodwin and Friedman, 2006, and self-esteem, in parentheses, Robbins et al., 2001. In this case, the point about personality traits predicting health is supported by the Goodwin and Friedman study, and it predicting self-esteem is supported by the Robbins et al. Study. So each of these works are cited in separate parentheses after the points they support. The opposite scenario is when you have multiple sources that all make the same point, and you cite those works together in the same parenthetical or narrative citation. In cases like this, the number of sources that you're going to cite in those for those points will vary by the complexity of the topic or the amount of previous research on it. For multiple parenthetical citations, alphabetize the works by different authors and separate them with semicolons in the same parentheses as shown in the first column. For multiple narrative citations, you can put the works in any order, which may be alphabetical, although chronological order is often used. Then use the standard punctuation you would use in any list between the authors. In this case, the two authors' names are separated by the word "and" in the narrative of the sentence. In both cases, if multiple works being cited are by the same author, write that author's name only once, and then write the dates in chronological order and separate them with commas. Citations with no date will precede citations with dates, and in-press citations will follow citations with dates. So in the examples for both formats, you'll see that Wong et al. Is written once, followed by the dates of publication ordered chronologically and separated by commas. As shown, the work dated ND comes first, followed by the 2019 work, then the 2020 work, and lastly, the in-press work. Finally, with parenthetical citations, sometimes alphabetical order obscures the most important or timely research. So while there are multiple relevant sources supporting your point, you want to draw emphasis to a particular work. This is often a seminal or important study or the most recent research on a topic. To highlight a work, place the important citation first in parentheses. Then put a semicolon, the word see also, and write the remaining citations in alphabetical order. In this case, Zimmerman 2020 is the work being highlighted, so it is put first, and then the remaining citations follow in alphabetical order. A special case of paraphrasing are long paraphrases, which can be especially tricky to cite appropriately and without over or under citing, because the mere presence of citations does not guarantee that ideas are properly credited and that arguments are effectively supported. It is also important to follow best practice and cite an appropriate level, which is what I will discuss now. Long paraphrases describe one idea or a related set of ideas from a single source or set of sources and continue for multiple consecutive sentences or even paragraphs. This may be the case when you want to describe a seminal study that inspired the research in your current paper, or you are discussing context for a study you are replicating, or when your students are describing a study they had to read for an assignment. And the result is that more than one repeated sentence citing that same work. We often are worried about underciting in our papers, which is of course problematic by obscuring the original source of information and potentially leading to plagiarism. But overcitation, which is repeating the same source, usually in sentence after sentence, when the source, context, and paragraph have not changed, can also be problematic, and long paraphrases are apt to lead to overcitation. You want to avoid overciting because it can produce distracting or unreadable text that pulls attention away from the points you're trying to make in your writing. It is also pretty annoying for readers in many cases, especially those using screen readers, who have to hear the same source repeated despite remaining the same. As an instructor or writer, overcitation can also often be a sign of relying too much on a single source. Except for things like professional review articles, multiple citations for a single point are rarely warranted. And lastly, overcitation artificially inflates word count, which many students may not consider problematic, but instructors or journals with limited page space might. Sorry about that. So here we have an example of a paraphrase that is overcited. You can read it on the screen, and I'll also read it aloud to you. The values and action taxonomy measures character traits, parentheses, Peterson and Seligman, 2004. The taxonomy contains 6 universal virtue domains: wisdom and knowledge, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence, in parentheses, Peterson and Seligman, 2004. Each domain has associated traits. For example, kindness is a trait of the humanity demands, Peterson and Seligman, 2004. Now, this is an example of overcitation because all sentences address the same topic, in this case, the values and action taxonomy. Nouns are repeated to link the sentences, for instance, taxonomy in the first 2 sentences, and domain in the next 2 sentences, showing that they each follow the other. And all of those subsequent sentences build on and provide more detail about the previous sentences, indicating that they're all connected and related to that originally cited study. Instead, when paraphrasing a single work from multiple sentences in a paragraph, it is often better to cite the work on first mention using either the parenthetical or narrative format. And then, if it is clear you're referring to that same source, you do not need to repeat the citation in subsequent sentences, again, if that source does not change. Here we have an example of a long paraphrase that includes a single citation in parenthetical format. The values and action taxonomy measures character traits. Parentheses, Peterson, Seligman, 2004. The taxonomy contains 6 universal virtue domains: wisdom and knowledge, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. Each domain has associated traits. For example, kindness is a trait of the humanity domain. In this case, we included just one parenthetical citation at the beginning of the paraphrase. This is sufficient citation because the sentence structure shows that those ideas are related and come from the same source. So readers know the original citation applies to all 3 sentences. Long paraphrases can also be cited with a narrative citation. And narrative citations can be useful when writing long paraphrases, because including the author's name in the text gives you an opportunity to link the sentences using that name or a pronoun. And then you can omit the date in subsequent narrative citations. Unless you have multiple works by the same author in your reference list, in which case the dates will be necessary in all cases to clarify the works. Here is an example of a long paraphrase in narrative format with the date omitted in subsequent citations. From 1955, argued that the central challenge of being human was overcoming the human inevitabilities of loneliness and insignificance through union with nature, other people, and the diverse aspects of the self. For from, healthy people are productive, happy, and self-directed. In this example of a long paraphrase, from 1955 is mentioned at the start of the paragraph to introduce the source, and then mentioned again in the second sentence, except this time without repeating the date. It's clear you're referring to that same source. To summarize, you do not need to repeat citations when the context makes clear which citations apply to which information, and if that information is referred to again within that same context. However, you repeat a citation if the paraphrase continues into a new paragraph, or you cite other sources and then return to the previous one. Basically, anytime the context changes or new sources are introduced, provide a citation to make sure the attributions are clear. Here we have the example paraphrase. The values and action taxonomy measures character traits. Parentheses, Peterson and Seligman, 2004. Some researchers have questioned whether the taxonomy is distinct from the Big Five personality model. In parentheses, for example, Knopfler et al., 2011. However, proponents of the values and action taxonomy have critiqued basic personality models for being too negligent of positive characteristics. Parentheses, Peterson and Seligman, 2004. As shown, we switched between making points cited by the Peterson and Seligman study and the Knopfler et al. Study. So a parenthetical citation is needed after every sentence to keep the attributions clear. I will now turn the presentation over to Chelsea to show you how to add citations to direct quotations.
Hello, everyone. I am going to talk about how to add citations to direct quotations. So when you're citing a quotation, the process of doing so is it builds off of how you cite paraphrases, and that's why we've put it later in the presentation. The 2 formats that APA uses for quotations are dependent on quotation length. Both formats, the citation will always include the author, the year, and the page number or other location information. So the lengths are short, which is fewer than 40 words. Those quotations you put in double quotation marks and you incorporate the quotation into the sentence that you're writing. For a longer quotation, we call that a block quotation. That's 40 words or more. And those are presented in an indented block. The whole thing is indented 1/2 inch from the left margin with no quotation marks around it, and the block is double spaced. So I'm first going to take you through short quotations and how you incorporate those into your sentence. So some problems we see with beginner writers is that they might put a quotation and have just the quotation stand for itself, speak for itself. Rather than doing that, you want to integrate the quotation into your own writing. To do that, you're either going to use a comma or colon or no punctuation to introduce the quotation. There's lots of ways to do it, but I'm showing you 3 here on the screen. For example, you might say, the author 2020 stated, comma, and then the quotation and then the page number. Or you might write a sentence and say, the results are clear, colon, and then put the quotation and then the citation after the quotation. You could do it like that. Or you could have the quotation smoothly flow through your sentence and say, researchers found that, and then put the quotation and then the citation. And so something you can do here is you can adjust the capitalization of the first word of a quotation to fit the grammar structure of your sentence. Okay. So as we discussed previously, there are both parenthetical and narrative formats. You choose either one for each paraphrase or quotation that you're writing. So, for example, if you want to use the parenthetical format for a short quotation, the format that you would use would be the words of your sentence, the quotation, and then after the quotation, put in parentheses the author, a comma, the year, a comma, and then the page number. And you'll see here that the period for the end of the sentence goes after the citation. And the reason it goes after the citation is it shows that the citation is part of that sentence. And there is an example there on the screen of a quotation from Blydorn et al. You can see the quotation itself, good self-regulatory skills, an optimistic outlook on the world, and a clear and stable self-view, and then the parenthetical citation after. You can also use the narrative format for a quotation if you'd like. For a narrative citation of a short quotation, the format you will use is the author and then the date in parentheses, a verb of some form, like they found, and then the quotation, and then put the page number in parentheses after the quotation. And once again, the period for the end of the sentence goes after the page number in parentheses. So here is the same quote as on the previous screen in a different format. So now Blydorn et al. 2020 appears at the beginning of the sentence because now they're part of the narrative. You present the quotation, close quotation marks, and then the parenthetical page number, and then the period for the end of the sentence. Now let's take a look at block quotations. So this is your quotations that are longer, 40 words or more. You can again use either the parenthetical or narrative format. It's up to you. You decide on a case-by-case basis. For the parenthetical format, you'll have a sentence that introduces your quotation. That'll just be like part of a regular paragraph, and then present the quote as an indented block. Put the period or whatever punctuation ends the quotation, and then put the citation. So you can see that that's the opposite of how you do it when it's a short quotation. The example on the screen shows another quotation from the Blydorn et al. Article. And the sentence that I wrote is, the study may have limited generalizability, colon, and then the quotation begins with the majority of our validation samples, and it goes on, and the end of the quotation is, for example, old age. That's the end of the quote, then the period, which is highlighted in yellow, and then the parenthetical citation follows. If you want to use the narrative format for a block quotation, it's quite similar. You'll want to put the name of the author and the year in the sentence that you write, the quotation, the period, and then the parenthetical page number. So you can see in the example here that Blydorn et al. 2020 addressed limits to generalizability. That's the sentence that I wrote. And then we have the same block quotation. It ends after the words old age, and then the page number in parentheses follows. For changes to quotations, there are style guidelines that address lots of different topics. And we recommend that when you're wanting to make an adjustment to a quotation, that you consult the guidelines rather than trying to memorize all of them. One thing that we mentioned was that you can change the capitalization of the first word of the quote. That's fine to do. However, if you need to make other kinds of changes, for example, if there's spelling errors or the punctuation is strange or the grammar doesn't fit the grammar that you need, or if you need to omit words, or you need to add words, or you need to add emphasis to make the quotation make sense, then there's guidelines that explain how you do that, because it's important for readers to know if you've made these kind of more significant adjustments. And those guidelines are in section 831. And another solution in that case would be to paraphrase instead, and then you can save yourself all that trouble. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more in depth about page numbers, because as I'm sure you know, not everything has a page number. And what do you do when you need a page alternative? So just to begin, when a work does have page numbers, you get to use them in a quotation citation. The abbreviations that are used in APA style are as follows. For the word page, we use P period, lowercase p. And so the example here is page 26, P period 26 with a space in between. If it's a page range, the abbreviation is PP period, and then the page range. And if it's discontinuous pages, you use a comma. Now, what about works that don't have page numbers? If the work is text, like it's a web page or an ebook, then you have to use some other location identifier instead of a page number. And we recommend that you customize the approach based on how the work itself is organized. And so the table on screen shows a number of different options for you. For example, you could use a paragraph number instead of a page number. So if you're reading a web page and the quotation you want is in the second paragraph down from the top, you would give the author of the year and then para 2, as shown in the example. That's one way you can do it. You can also give a heading or a section name. So in the example by Golden 2019, there's a section called the anatomy section, and a person who was reading that work would see the section label anatomy, and they would go in and they would see where the quotation is. Likewise, if the section name is super long and you want to abbreviate it, you can write a short version of it in your paper inside quotation marks. And then you can also use a combination of identifiers. So you might use a section number plus a paragraph number. It all depends on how complicated the work is and how specific of directions you need to give to the person to find the quotation. But it's important to give some direction, because if you give no direction, the reader won't know whether it's a mistake that you left it out, or they might be confused. So it's important to have a page number alternative. Another kind of work that doesn't have page numbers are audiovisual works, such as audiobooks, films, TV shows, streaming videos on YouTube. In this case, we recommend that you use a timestamp that corresponds to the beginning of the quotation instead of a page number. And you should use the timestamp or like whatever direction is related to the way that you're looking at the work. So for example, this quote on the bottom of the screen, research on teamwork demonstrates how, quote, personal relationships are key to teams, end quote, Conte 2020, 122. Here, 122 means 1 minute, 22 seconds in. If your work is organized differently, like it has chapters or titles, just give directions based on the work that you're using. Another case is works that have canonical section numbers. So this would apply to religious and classical works, for example, the Bible, or ancient Greek and Roman works, plays like Shakespeare. And what this means is that across all of the versions, the names of the chapters or like the scenes and the acts, it's all the same, it's standardized. And so when you have this standardized system, you should use that in the citation rather than the page numbers of the specific version that you happen to be reading. And so, for example, here on the screen is a quotation from the New International Version of the Bible. And the quotation reads, people should choose their friends wisely because, quote, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another, end quote. And then the name of the book, which that's the name of the version of the Bible that this comes from, years of publication of that particular version, which is why it says 1978/2011, and then the chapter and verse, which here is Proverbs 27:17. And again, that will all vary depending on what work you're quoting from. Practice time. So we heard from you in our last webinar that you enjoy having the chance to practice these APA style guidelines so that you can really get them nailed down. And to that end, we have 2 new instructional aids to share with you. Our instructional aids are on the APA style website. The instructional aids is one of the main sections of the webpage that you can access from the top banner. All of them are free for you to use, and you can use them for yourself. You can use them in your classes, at the library. There's 3 sections, tutorials and webinars, and this webinar will be posted there in the tutorials and webinars section within a couple of days after the file is available. And our previous webinars, if you weren't able to attend those, are also available on our website. We also have aids that are handouts and guides, and then sample papers as well. What I want to show you all today are 2 new handouts and guides. The first one is a paraphrasing and citation activity. This is an opportunity for you to practice paraphrasing. Practicing paraphrasing one sentence, practice paraphrasing, practice summarizing multiple sentences, and practice a long paraphrase. So what you're going to do is you're going to read a published sentence, and then you're given the source information. You write your paraphrase, write your reference list entry, and then add your in-text citation to the sentence that you wrote. And one thing that's nice is that the activity has interactive fields, so you can type it in your computer and you don't need to print it out. And so there's a number of different activities that go through, and at the end are answers from the APA style team. So you can see how we would do it versus how you did it, and you can compare as well among your colleagues or your students. The other instructional aid I want to share with you is called the in-text citation checklist. And this breaks down the principles that we talked about in this webinar into checklist form. And once again, it's interactive, so you can click the box and it'll give you a check mark or an X to help you make sure that you are paraphrasing and directly quoting effectively. So it's addressing things like the amount and the quality of your paraphrasing, the formats for paraphrasing, the formats for quotation, checking the correspondence between your in-text citations to make sure they match the reference list, and then last, looking at reference list entry formats. So those are both available right now on the APA style website on the instructional aids page. And I'll pop a link in the chat to them as well. We are now at the portion of the program where we are going to answer some questions from you all. And we've been answering throughout the chat as well, but I've written down some of the questions that we wanted to answer with talking to you rather than just typing the answer. A few of those, and my colleague Tim has also gathered some. Let's see, some of the ones that I pulled out that I want to address. I saw the question, how many citations is too many? How many citations is too few? So when you're asking that question, I would say 0 is too few. 0 citations is not enough. I would say for most works, for each point you're making, 1 or 2 citations is what published authors do. So
And
if you're a student writer, it might be just the one citation that shows that. Yes, Haley.
I would also jump in and say if you're seeing yourself wanting to include many citations for the same point, it may indicate that this is a heavily researched area. And so just looking for a review article or meta-analysis on that same topic that kind of encompasses all of those studies is a really good way to avoid having multiple individual studies cited.
That's a really great point. And you can actually tell your readers what you're directing them to. For example, you can say, for an overview of literature, see this study. And that way, the reader knows why there's only one citation and not, a whole pile of them. Let's see, what else do I want to ask about? For over-citation, why does the in-text citation come after the first sentence and not at the end of the paragraph? That is a great question. And the reason that we recommend that you put the citation at the beginning is that way the reader knows when you begin talking about somebody else's ideas or findings. Because if you have to wait till the end of the paragraph, they might have to reverse course and say, now when did this idea begin? Because when you put it in the first sentence, we're saying, starting from this sentence, this is Seligman's idea. And then if you keep discussing Seligman's work, your sentences should make it clear that you're still discussing Seligman's work, in which case you don't need to repeat a citation. If it's not clear, then that's a case that you should repeat the citation because it's not clear. And so making sure that there's clear attribution is the key, and also making sure that you establish the attribution right off the bat is very important. And then the last thing that I definitely wanted to talk about was I saw a number of questions about, does it matter if you use parenthetical or narrative format? And to make it clear, for each case that you want to cite a work, pick one of those two formats for each case. But across the whole paper, you can vary it and you can use whatever format that you want. The point is that when you're writing a sentence, you won't put two citations in the same sentence. Like you won't say, Smith 2020 said cats are the best pet, parentheses, Smith 2020, because that sentence would have two citations in it to the same work. You wouldn't do that, that would be redundant. So just on a case-by-case basis, you want to choose parenthetical or narrative.
And Chelsea, jumping in, a question I just saw that's kind of related to that question about how many citations you want to include. It was someone asking about why sometimes in the parentheses we just had the author and date for the citation, and sometimes we preceded author and date with e.g. or for example. And so I wanted to let readers know that, or our attendees know that e.g. isn't required. You may do that if, like we just said, you have many studies on that same topic and you want to indicate that you're just using one as an example to support your point. It's not kind of the seminal or only study on that topic, in which case you may precede the citation with e.g., indicating this is just an example of one study that supports the point you're making. And then, Chelsea, I also got a couple of questions related to page numbers and what you were talking about. One being whether page numbers are only used with direct quotations.
Great question. So our recommendation is when you're citing a quotation, yes, definitely always use the page number. When you're paraphrasing, including a page number is optional. I will say that for most published authors, most of them don't include page numbers with paraphrases. And the reason is that often they're summarizing a whole study. And so, what would you put, the page numbers for the entire article? So that's because they're summarizing that it tends not to be as relevant for paraphrasing. However, there's lots of cases when it might be relevant. For example, if you're reading a really complicated book and there's just one part that you want to paraphrase, adding the page number would be very helpful to the reader because they would know where in the book to go. And so if you are a student and you're writing and you want to include a page number with every citation, you can do that. And if you're a professor grading papers and you see lots of page numbers with paraphrases, that's totally fine to do. It's just not required.
Okay. And I also saw two questions that I think just need to be answered for points of clarification. someone was thinking that the abbreviations PP and P are used only for page numbers in books and not in periodicals. But anytime for any type of work, when you are including page numbers, you use those same abbreviations. And you may want to include the page number for any number of types of works in textual form.
Yep. Thank you.
Then someone had asked, I think this had to do with when you were citing multiple pages, which may be continuous versus discontinuous, what that difference is. So when you have the continuous, you're using the end dash to separate that page range, whereas when it's discontinuous is when you use the comma between the page numbers.
Yep. Yeah. Tim, can you share some of the questions you gathered with us?
Sure. There were a couple questions about the spelling out and doing the ampersand. I think that's covered on a previous slide if we can skip to it. There's also a question about whether we recommend using sites that generate citations and or generate references and citations. I mean, yes, it's helpful, but double check. I would say, use it if it helps you manage your work, but double check whether it's formatted correctly. And that's all I had before. Let me check back.
Yeah. Thanks. So I had another point I wanted to clarify, and I didn't go into detail on this during my presentation, but someone made a great point that when you're adding more authors' names to avoid ambiguity, if the work only has 3 authors, you would never use that all for that instead of that last author's name, because you're only replacing and others. If you're only replacing one name, it wouldn't be necessary. So if you're adding more authors and you added 2 and you would add all 3 to avoid having it all to replace only one name in text citation.
Awesome. Another question I saw shared is about it says, how would you handle 2 departments of education since the reference uses the most specific name? Did I miss something about how to deal with government agencies that have the same name but are different governments? So I think in this situation, you're talking about there's the U.S. Department of Education and then there's the Canadian Department of Education, but they're both just called Department of Education. And how do you tell them apart? That's a case where that's only going to happen to you if you happen to be writing about international departments of education. So the way that you would end up dealing with that, I think there could be a few different ways that you could do it. You could put the country name in the front and say U.S. Department of Education, Canadian Department of Education. That would be clear, because the point is to make sure it's clear to readers which one you mean. And that's a good example of sometimes these strange sort of complicated situations emerge with references, and your goal should always be that your reader understands what you're doing, and that would be what I would recommend for that situation.
There's a question about whether students should cite their own work, their own previous papers. There is a little bit about that in the publication manual, and we basically leave that up to the instructors to say whether or not they're okay with that, but you should certainly cite anything that you've written. It's self-plagiarism if you don't indicate that it's your own work that you're quoting from or paraphrasing.
And then I just saw a recent question come in asking something that's pretty common for student papers, which is that if you have a reference list that's consisting of only one source, say for a student paper, can you write reference singular instead of references plural? And the answer is yes, that is effectively describing your work. And that's the point that we address on our creating a reference list checklist, which is one of the instructional aids on the APA style website. And I also asked someone asking us to clarify where they can find that. And all those instructional aids, including all of our handouts, the ones that Chelsea talked about, and so a whole bunch of other ones, and then the recording of this tutorial, of this webinar and others, can all be accessed from the top of the APA style website. There is a tab for instructional aids. So it's really easy to get to and access all the resources we talked about during the presentation.
Excellent. So this is Mark jumping in from Choice and ACRL. We are coming up to the end of our time today, so I would just like to take a moment to remind everybody out there that they should be on the lookout within about 24 hours for an email from us with a link to this presentation. And you should also see in your chat box there a link to a response survey so that you can let us know what you thought of today's webinar or what you'd like to see in the future, those sorts of things. So please do take a minute to fill that out. It's very brief, only 6 questions, and we really appreciate your feedback there. I would also, of course, love to take a little time to say thank you to Tim and to Chelsea and to Haley for walking us through really a lot of information on in-text citation. I know there's a ton here, and based on what I've been seeing in the chat box, folks are looking forward to getting the recording so they can dive into some of these things again. So thank you very much. And I think lastly, I would just say thank you to all of you out there for tuning in today and taking in all of this information. We appreciate your time, and we hope to see you again in the near future. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.